My name is Gary Danelski. Today, April 23rd, 2012, I and my colleague, Dr. Sally Wilson, are going to interview Dr. David A. Rodgers as part of the Ohio Psychological Association's Oral History Project. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about this remarkable man. Dr. Rodgers obtained his doctorate from the University of Chicago and postdoctoral training from Stanford University. In 1966, he left a faculty position at the University of California at Berkeley and came to Cleveland, where he established a section of psychology at the Cleveland Clinic. He directed that section for over 20 years. Before David Rodgers came to Ohio, psychology was fragmented and without a licensing law. Anyone, regardless of training, could use the name psychologist and pretend to do what a psychologist does. Almost single-handedly, Dave changed all of that. He, more than any other person, was responsible for composing the Ohio licensing law and getting it written into law. This law was later to serve as a model for licensing laws in several other states. Dr. Rodgers also had a major impact on the education of psychologists. For many years, he worked tirelessly to convince psychologists, the public, and the legislature that a professional school of psychology was both desirable and necessary. When this dream was finally about to be realized, Dave took a year of leave from the Cleveland Clinic, traveled to Dayton weekly, and together with Dr. Ron Fox actually put in place the nuts and bolts plan for what was to become the Professional School of Psychology at Wright State University. Dave was one of the two founders of the professional school, along with Dr. Fox, and this school has received national acclaim as one of the leading professional schools in existence. Dave has also been active in psychology organizations at the local, state, and national levels. He has served as president of the Ohio Psychology State Licensing Board. He was president of the Ohio Psychological Association not once but twice. He held major governance positions with the American Psychological Association. He recently served as president of the National Academies of Practice, a national organization encompassing many of the leaders of the 10 major healthcare professions, and has been instrumental in making it a much more active and relevant national organization. More than anyone I have ever known, Dr. Rodgers has a vision of what psychology can become. His ability to articulate this vision is, in my opinion, unparalleled. On a personal level, I am privileged to have known Dr. Rodgers for over 40 years and am proud to call him one of my close friends. Welcome, Dave, to today's interview.
Thank you, Gary. Let me just comment. It's impressive how good graffiti can look when you use the right spray paint.
Very good.
Well, I guess I get to start. And Dr. Rodgers, Dave, it's been my pleasure and privilege to know you through the Ohio Psychological Association, the former Cleveland Academy of Consulting Psychologists, and the current Cleveland Psychological Association. We know your passion for psychology, and we thank you and appreciate that. Gary is going to ask you about the period of leaving California for Ohio, but I'm wondering if you would take a few minutes to just reflect on what led you to choose the field of psychology and clinical psychology to begin with. Perhaps also what your research and specialty interests have been.
That goes back. My original academic interests were in chemical engineering. They weren't such academic interests as they were practical vocational interests. This was coming out of the Depression before the current one, the late great as we used to call it, but it's way back there. And the Second World War was underway, and so I got into chemical engineering early on, came back from the Navy and went in and finished my degree at the University of Oklahoma. At that point, I had the choice of going to Procter & Gamble. I'd spent a summer there in help the engineering of soap. And the Kinsey report had just come out, so I was sitting around trying to figure out whether I would rather study the saponification of fat at night or read the Kinsey report. Well, the GI Bill was providing tuition coverage for those that had been in service, so I had about a year of 2 years actually, GI Bill time available. My liberal arts training at that time had been 9 hours. I had 147 out of a required 80 or some hours to graduate with my engineering degree, or 120 hours. And I had 6 hours of English grammar and 3 hours of German language that I took the 3 hours wasn't required, I just took it. So I had 9 hours of liberal arts work, and I figured it'd be fun to go to some place and just take all those things that I didn't know anything about. So my parents were living in Washington, D.C. at that time, so I went to the American University and picked courses in sociology, psychology, anthropology, whatever I wanted. And ended up, after the first semester, I realized I could get a major in psychology the second semester if I wanted to, and somehow studying people sounded a whole lot more interesting than studying facts. So I actually completed the requirements for a major in psychology and then applied to various schools. And Chicago was amenable, and my wife-to-be was already there, so I accepted and went to Chicago and got a degree in psychology.
Did you maintain your interest in sexual psychology? The Kinsey report is about that. Or did you have other research and specialty interests?
Oh, the sexual kind of thing wasn't a preoccupation particularly. It enters into human behavior.
Sure.
I did actually do a fair amount of research on contraceptive interests and whatnot after I left Berkeley, but that wasn't a particular interest. My interests were in trying to understand how humans behaved. One of the more interesting questions that a lecturer asked at the University of Chicago was what he always hoped to answer was, what is a human that a human can know a number, and what is a number that a human can know it? That always intrigued me as a legitimate question in psychology, but it was...
Your research area? Your doctoral area?
I've been writing about it recently, I guess, but my doctoral area was in personality and psychopath. My major was personality and psychopathology. My area of study was the behavior of salesmen. It was social role theory, self-concept, and that kind of thing, which was primitive then and is still primitive. But
Thank you.
that was my degree.
Gary?
Now let's find out why you left the sunny climes of California to come to Ohio. Perhaps you were longing for scenery a little more like that of your native Oklahoma?
The short answer to that is fairly easy, and to correct an error, I came here from the Scripps Clinic and Research Foundation in La Jolla, California, not from Berkeley. I was on faculty at Berkeley for a while, and then I was at the Brain Research Institute at UCLA, and then I was down at the Scripps Clinic and actually started the clinical psychology program in Scripps Clinic, where I was really doing half-time clinical work and half-time research work. At that time, speaking of research interests, it was on inbred strains of mice and alcohol consumption, trying to figure out what underlay alcoholism, that kind of thing. But the short answer is that many institutions in California and along the West Coast use climate as an excuse for trying to get people to stay in spite of bad management. And the Scripps Clinic at that time had just brought in Frank Dixon with the largest grant that NIH had ever given to study immune responses and cancer kinds of things. The Scripps Clinic had been built around a pattern of clinical work and research, so that most of the major people at Scripps were doing half-time research and half-time clinical work. Well, the director, whose name I psychologically have repressed for years and can't recall at this point, arbitrarily made the decision, and he has the power to do that. Well, now that we have a real researcher here, all of you half-time researchers and all you clinicians will have to go to work full-time to help us pay for this real researcher that we have. Well, 8 department heads resigned at one time. I could have stayed on, actually, but the person I was working with, the psychiatrist, Fred Ziegler, was leaving, and I figured I didn't have a quotes patron in the medical field there that would support me. I did have a mouse lab in the building that was being built for Frank Dixon, basement cube in the basement, and word was from him that I could stay there, but then the word came down that he'd really like that space for his work. So there was an old apartment building next door on the clinic grounds of La Jolla Hospital at that time. The Research Foundation is now Scripps, moved up the hill, but at that time it was downtown at the hospital. And there was a house next door that had was a small apartment kind of thing. It had a picture window that looked out over the Pacific, so I allowed them to force me to move my mouse lab into that facility, and we had a gorgeous picture window view of the ocean out in front of us, and did very well then for about a year or two. But I decided the future wasn't there. An office is about the same wherever you are, and it just didn't look like the kind of place to go. So Fred and I were looking around. I figured if it was a medical facility, a clinical facility, I'd stay with him. If it were an academic facility, I'd probably go on my own, that kind of thing. But Norma, my wife, has family here in Cleveland, and the clinic has a fine reputation. We both were offered a job here, so we took it.
Great. Yeah. And have you missed the sunny climes of California much?
After hours. Cleveland is a fine place.
Yeah.
It's a better place to bring up children than the beachfront of California. Fewer, more history and culture.
Right.
Here.
And California was pretty turbulent back then, during that period too. It was becoming...
Well, I was in Berkeley, of course, during the heyday of the Haight-Ashbury activities. And it had its problems.
Yeah.
Well, you've been very significant to the history of psychology in Ohio, and we're thinking now about the licensing laws, because as we understand, things were not in good order when you arrived in Ohio, and that you got involved. And tell us a little bit about the licensing law history, if you would, please.
All right, a bit of background. I've been in academia, I've been in clinical practice, and I had been in some of the organizational structures in California and whatnot. California had passed their licensing law a couple of years sooner. I hadn't been actively involved in passing it, but had been involved in some of the implementation of it and that kind of thing. Academia does not really need public regulation because it's somewhat self-correcting. Science, you propose some theory, if it works, fine. It's built on. If it doesn't, if someone else challenges it, they do the research that proves it's wrong, and it's wrong. And you don't need regulation. Clinical work is not the same. People that come to see you don't have the knowledge base, they don't have the experience to judge what you're doing, and you can have all kinds of nonsense go on in the name of good clinical work. Back in those days, we had EST, we had the primal scream, we had all kinds of approaches. It was ignorance profound. And under those kinds of circumstances, in my bias in practice, when one is trying to deal with most human problems, the practitioner is generally dealing with ignorance. If you know what to do, you have a technician that knows how to do it, and you have a technological structure, and you plug someone in and it gets done. If you don't know what to do, you go to a practitioner, and the practitioner's primary skill is in dealing with ignorance, not with knowledge. Well, if you have a naive profession, then you have a lot of people that are quite willing to try all kinds of things, often quite disastrously. So that clinical work clearly needed some external oversight. Whereas our structures, all of our academic structures, were built around academic needs, which didn't include lobbying legislators and that kind of thing. And it was very difficult to gain any leverage to get done what needed to be done. Well, the licensing movement, actually certification at that time, started in Connecticut in 1946, so licensing had been around for a long time. Ohio had it at that time, when I came here in 1966, it had its own certification program. You could go down and your colleagues would evaluate you, and if you were in effect kosher, then you'd could get a certification from the state. But it was one without significant teeth. It just didn't do much. But the need for someone in Cleveland, say at the Cleveland Clinic, to refer someone who was moving to California, refer them to a psychologist out there, or to Colorado, or to wherever. You did not know, unless you knew the psychologist personally, you did not know what kind of help they were going to get. You literally did not. So the need for standardization was quite high, and the whole field was talking about how we go about this. Well, Ohio's history had been that they had tried to get a licensing law through. Ohio suffered at that time, and I use suffered in quotes, from having a very strong and very competent school psychology program, plus a developing and very strong and generally competent clinical psychology program, plus having strong academic departments at various universities that were into preserving academia. You have three relatively powerful groups: the school psychologists from the point of view of clinical psychology, and what was developing as the national standard was based at the master's level rather than at the doctoral level. This was appropriate because they were working in a school system where the superintendents didn't really know how to cope with a higher level educational degree as a base, and the schools had their own certification program, so that it was a confusing picture. The history had been that Ohio had submitted licensing bills a number of times, and nothing ever happened. The primary base of the Ohio Psychological Association, which had been the group that submitted bills, was in Columbus at the University of Ohio State. So it was mixed with an academic base and an OPA base that was basically academia. Academia needs groups like OPA, although more than OPA, it needed the regional groups. It needed the Midwest, the various regional groups, because that gave a larger base for papers and for research and for exchange of ideas and this kind of thing. So OPA was, quotes, available for capture. That's what some of us in Cleveland thought. And in fact it was. It was not essential to academia, it was essential to the clinical group. You just absolutely need a powerful state representatives. We could set up our own and came close to doing that, but OPA really was amenable to considering the clinical issues. Its history had been to try to get a law through by watering down what was in the law so that it wouldn't displease anyone. As a result, it wouldn't please some of us that thought we knew what clinical psychology really needed to be like to be effective. The Cleveland group had been discussing this for some time, and but didn't have real access to the power structure in Columbus. So there are stories that I will and will not get into about what happened in Cleveland. But we decided that it really was time we tried to put through an effective bill, not just any bill. So we started to work through CPA, which at that time was divided power-wise. I'm using school psychology not because it was an inappropriate group, it was an extremely appropriate group and very effective, but it was anchored at the master's level. Clinical psychology, at least some of us thought, should be anchored at the doctoral level, and that was a national standard. And the conflict between the two had to be resolved somehow. We resolved it here in Cleveland temporarily by forming the Cleveland Academy of Consulting Psychologists, which was the clinical group, to pull away from a stalemate that, and Don Friedheim can maybe tell you about the stalemate between school psychology and clinical psychology in CPA. Then CACP really took over trying to develop a bill. We went to OPA. Jane Kessler was president of OPA at that time. I forget some of the details, but she agreed. I said I'd take on the role of trying to push a licensing law if I could do it my way And if any time the the OPA board felt that I was not doing it appropriately, I'd be glad to walk away and they could do it. I would not do it their way. I wouldn't just be a representative of what OPA demanded. And that was fine. So that's a group of us here in Cleveland started working on drafting a bill. Carl Wasmuth was chair of medicine at the Cleveland Clinic at the time. He was a physician and an attorney. I went to him and he assigned one of his attorney aides to work with us. No restraints whatsoever, just draw up a good bill. And so the clinic provided a lot of backup support and legal aid. This was a young guy who was very good, and we wrote draft after draft. We went over the drafts that had been done and tried to put together my philosophy at the time, and Jack Wiggins and the others here in Cleveland bought into it certainly. Let's draw the strongest bill we can and then back away as much as we have to, if we have to get it through. Let's not start with one that we assume isn't going to offend anyone. Well, strongest bill that we could draw was not contrary to the best interest of medicine. I didn't see it then, and I still don't see it. Medicine benefits from competent psychologists, and the clinic felt that they would benefit from competent psychologists. It wasn't competition. My bias then, and that's still something that our profession struggles with that I regret, tends to see, my bias is I see psychology as dealing with very different things in very different ways than medicine deals with. Medicine deals with biological error. Psychology deals with biologically based behavior. There's no question about the biological base, but it's not the biological error we deal with. We deal with the information processing error. It's the software of the computer, not the hardware, that is our primary focus. It's why do we think the things we think, even though our physiology, our brain is intact. It's not that it's not done by our brain, but it's that our brain can be perfectly intact and we can have major psychological problems. That seems to me to make a clear difference between medicine and psychology that makes them completely complementary, not competitive. And
Gary, at this point, can I ask you, are there other questions about the licensing law that come to your mind?
Well, I was privileged to come to the clinic just when Dave was involved in this, and I remember he would spend a lot of time and energy dealing with one word in the licensing law to try to make sure, to try to get a consensus or a compromise or whatever, but he would try different words out, and I said, what a process this is. And then I went down to Columbus and watched what happened. And Dave, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the reactions of other psychologists, because I had never been in the legislative process before. That was my first experience with that. And I was amazed how psychologists were basically attacking one another on that whole process. And it was like a real experience for me. I don't know if you recall it that way, Dave.
That's a good description of it. The problem with psychology had been, as I say, there was conflict within psychology. It was a three-way conflict, actually. The most obvious was a two-way conflict between school psychology and clinical psychology as to what level a bill would be. We'd all talked about a generic bill that would cover everyone, but the question was one of the levels, or if we had a two-level bill. The other conflict was with academia, and academia's attitude was, well, these clinicians are kind of second-class people anyway, and it doesn't make much difference what they have, but they ought to be controlled. They ought to be under medicine. They aren't competent of being real professionals. And these are the people that were training clinical psychologists, because the stupidity of our field, there are those who will object to that statement, but the stupidity of our field is that we've based it on the concept of the scientist practitioner. The scientist, the PhD base, is a very different breed of cat from the practitioner who is applying whatever knowledge there is. The practitioner needs to know what's out there, but their primary goal is, first of all, do no harm. Second, try to help the person as best you can in an area of ignorance, until third, you can build a base where you know what you're doing and let the technologist take over and make it work. The scientist is, let's test the limits, let's put the metal to stress until it breaks, and then we know how much it can stand. Well, you don't do that. If your theory is that telling someone what the truth is ought to get them out of their depression, and they're standing on the top of a building and getting ready to jump, and you want to try that out scientifically, you say, I think you're stupid and if they jump, you prove your point. Well, that's not the way you do it clinically. So that the science of academia was trying to both train and control the clinical psychologists. That was a mess. The other mess, of course, was that made it easy for medicine and all the other groups to oppose psychology's approach. And the legislators were quite upfront. They said, you come back when you're together and you can get something through. You'll never get through while you're divided. So the task was, can you get a perspective and an agreement, first of all, from the psychologists, second of all, outside the psychologists. We were doing such a bad job within psychology that the psychiatrists and others that might have a vested interest or thought they did in opposing us just stayed out of it. They just sort of felt they'd sit back and watch the squabble. Well, the school psychologists were, as I say, quite a competent group, and we sat down with them. I sat down with them and said, look, what do you really want in a licensing law? You have your certification law for your work in the schools. What you're talking about is independent practice of some sort. You can get your doctorate in school psychology and get licensed under these levels. What are you really looking for? And they said, well, we're looking for one thing. If someone comes into a school system, gets their child tested, they don't like what that school psychologist does through the schools, they want someone else they can go to get an independent assessment that they can use for their own purposes if they disagree with the school assessment. And I said, that doesn't sound to me like any great threat to doctoral level general license, that it's a specialty license that's perfectly appropriate. Their training is far better than anyone else's training for that kind of thing. And so we sat down, we wrote a secondary master's level school psychology license to cover precisely that. And they were happy with that, we were happy with that, and that broke that kind of barrier so that we'd go together as the practicing psychologists, and the academic psychologists hadn't even been paying attention. They just figured, oh, they'll squabble and not get... Well, suddenly it looked like the bill was on a fast track to get passed, and that was good because the legislative session was about to run out. And so some of them showed up and testified at some of the hearings, oh, this is terrible, this shouldn't be, because we know better. And we've been working with the legislature enough that it was quite clear that they were kind of out of their minds, and the legislature was totally supportive of us, and they had no impact whatsoever.
So you never really got a rapprochement with the academics. It's just that they weren't very effective in the legislature.
Well, with the academic, that's an exaggeration. Of course, there were many of them that were understanding and quite supportive, but there were a few that kind of liked their ego trips and their sense of authority and thought they would express them.
Now, if I can morph that just a little bit, there was a period then when the licensing law was open around continuing education, and that was another controversy. And do I recall that you were involved at that point too in that controversy?
The issue of continuing education has been an issue with psychology a bit from the beginning, although in general that came out of other areas that were going to require continuing education of all professions. I was involved with it in the sense that, again, conceptually, if you look at what a practitioner does, a practitioner deals with ignorance, and the only way to do that is to know as much basic science as you can, so you can put the practical issue in the perspective of the basic science. The education you need in that sense, in a practical sense, needs to be cutting edge education that you can get from your colleagues by, talking with someone in the next office better than you can. I've got this problem, and it's a problem that is not a common one or shouldn't be a problem. But then you talk it out, or you go to a conference and you say, you know, I've been having these kinds of people come in, and how do you deal with this? We had a lot of that going on in our conventions and this kind of thing. The problem with continuing education, if you looked at what was done then and if you look at what's been done since, continuing education has to make money. And what makes money is the most popular lecturers that cover the broadest issues that appeal to the most people that don't make critical sense because you don't really need to know them, or you'd have had to know them before you went to the lecture. So it's popularized the field, and everyone then, instead of feeling like they have to be responsible for understanding their own field, they go to the gurus and figure I'll follow the cookbook and do what they tell me to and earn my, in Ohio, my 10 hours of credit. So I was opposed to continuing education. I thought it would destroy the clinical value of our conventions, and I think it has. I thought it would cheapen what the best of us really thought was a necessary education to make things work, and it has. I just thought it would change the nature of the way we see our profession, and it has. It was introduced not by psychologists it was introduced by, her freshman year, Congressman from Cleveland Heights. Her name slips me at the moment, but she thought it would be an easy sell, and it was. It was her freshman year in the state legislature, and she introduced a continuing education bill. I think it was first pegged at about 23 hours a year, which is somewhat standard. We got it reduced to 10 hours a year, and that's workable. But if you look at our continuing education kinds of things, instead of finding people that are there, cutting edge, questioning what's going on, what you find is people that are sitting with their hands in position, making sure they get there on time and leave after the time is over so they can get their certificate of I got this many hours credit. And that's about the main benefit. It does benefit those that are way behind and don't pay attention. It simply does not stimulate excellence, I don't think.
Okay, moving.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's your opinion.
Yes.
We're looking for those.
Moving on, and somewhat parallel to the licensing law, was the whole evolution of the Ohio Psychological Association. When you came into that, I guess that would probably be in the late 60s. Mm-hmm. It was a primarily academically oriented organization, and then it has changed profoundly to become quite oriented towards professional issues and practice. I wonder if you could just describe that in your own experiences. What happened during that period?
The transition was quite straightforward. OPA was trying to be all things to all people, which is appropriate. The academicians, as I say, didn't really need OPA. They switched to the regional groups and the APA and this kind of thing. The clinicians desperately needed a state organization that would do the lobbying and whatnot that need to be done. So OPA simply took on more and more duties of the clinical variety, of the practitioner variety. And that was the time when Henry Seaman came on the scene and took over as executive director, the first executive director of a state association, I think.
Yes, he was.
The need for an executive director was much greater with the clinical focus. And Henry simply helped the organization structure itself to be effective. It wasn't a matter of fighting anyone else. It was just a matter of making it effective in that area. And as it became more effective in that area, it became more valuable to the clinical group and less central to the academic group, and it just morphed.
I've been, of course, part of that history myself, many years on the board of OPA. And
More years attending the board than anyone else, as I recall.
I don't know if that's true anymore. But I do know this. We have tried throughout the years to recruit academics in, and we've had, I think, safe to say, limited success doing that. Even though many of these are training the people who later become the core of our membership. I wonder if you could address that a little bit. Why do you think that is, that it's been so difficult to attract the academic researchers on a regular basis into OPA?
I think there's an inherent difference between the academic, scientific, knowledge-based activity of the typical academic department and the applied practitioner-based orientation of the typical practitioner department, medical school, or engineering department, most fields, psychology is about the only one I can think of that doesn't. Most fields separate their knowledge-based channel from their applied-based channel. You have a physics department, you have an engineering department. You have a chemistry department, you have an engineering department. You have a medical school, and you have a biology department. You go across the board, you have political science, you have law school. They're not the same programs because their goals are different, their tactics are different, their skills are different, their interests are different. In psychology, when you try to combine those two, they don't need the same social structures. They don't need the same underpinning in a group like OPA. So OPA can either do both. Actually, this is what we recommended once for APA, that it become a multi-channel group that met at the top up here, but that implemented the structures below that. That didn't quite work out, but some other things did. So that OPA simply served the academicians less well, and they didn't need as expensive an organization as the clinicians needed, so that the cost of joining got higher than the academicians wanted to pay, and the focus was not always what they wanted. And much of the academic benefit of at least the state association was a trial group in which to show your prominence, your eminence, and your power. Well, the old positions of being president, of being on the board of OPA, they were dealing with issues that, OPA's board and president and whatnot were dealing with issues that were life and death to the clinical group that were not so relevant to the academic group, and they didn't care to make the sacrifice of running all those other things in order to get the brownie points of having another office to list on their vita. So it just didn't serve the academic's purpose once it got to the point of serving the clinical purposes.
Yet many of the students, their students, have become a bulwark of our new membership in the Ohio Psychological Association over the years.
Well, the students, again, the academia, for some reason, we still hang on to academia as a training ground for our students. Academia certainly has a lot to contribute in terms of basic knowledge. I don't see it as being the training ground for the hands-on practice. And yet the largest bulk of students that go to an academic department are clinically oriented students. So of course they're going to be interested in the profession that's
Which brings us into the next point very nicely, and that is we would like to hear what you have to say about the origin and development of the Wright State School of Professional Psychology.
Well, that was an obvious, again, my bias showed even then, I guess, that I really think the training of professionals should be in the hands of professionals. There was not a lot of support for that, but there was some, especially among some of the practitioners up here. And then Ron Fox, who was on the faculty down at Ohio State, was interested in putting together a professional school. He'd been following Peterson at Rodgers, and some of the professional schools that were swinging toward the PsyD, or at least toward professional schools. And he wanted to put it together, and I was eager to put it together, and I just happened to be president of OPA at the time, so we got together and we started pushing it, and I visited practically all of the, well, not all of them, but many of the programs, clinical programs in the state at that time. Nearly all of them turned us down. We wanted to do it through OPA as part of the professional school. And they were too threatened by it all. Well, Wright State was the one school that wasn't that threatened by it, because I think later I was quite convinced that the then chair of the department thought he would just let us get it started and then he'd take over it and run it the way he wanted to. He underestimated us a little. So that we finally got quite a lot of enthusiasm throughout the state to do it, and finally got a location in Wright State. They agreed to take it on. And then I took 6 months off. That time went down and Ron and I put it together. He put it together. We worked pretty well together on it. And there it was. We built it around some of the concepts that seemed to us to be relevant.
You took 6 months off to go down there. That's a real donation of time on a project like this.
Yes.
So what all were you involved in, and in addition to Ron Fox?
I'll tell you what I was involved in. This was 1976, I think, wasn't it? In 1970 and 71, psychology was really quite appreciated at the clinic. You know, we had people like Gary and Mike McKee and a few others that were respected down there. And we started putting together some psychological dimensions. Fred Ziegler is an excellent psychiatrist and an excellent social philosopher, and had been putting together a milieu therapy program in the psychiatric unit there. I was involved in that along with him. But he had gone back to California. His wife kind of liked the coast out there, so he's in Carmel these days still. We had begun building a milieu program and a behavioral approach to many of the mental illness problems. We were in conjunction with psychiatry. We certainly weren't ignoring the medication side, but we were doing more than that. Psychiatry, on the other hand, national health insurance was still struggling with where to go, and had decided that to cut costs by perhaps dividing mental health, schizophrenia, and the treatment of schizophrenia. The long-term hospitalization was always one of the big economic problems of mental illness. And one solution would be to cut off some mental illness side from the rest of illness, and ERISA and a few other bills were essentially doing that. Psychiatry deliberately decided that they should re-medicalize their practice so that you drop the knife between medicine in general and everything else, rather than between the non-mental illness and the mental illness kind of thing. That meant they refocused on biological dimensions of mental illness and away from the wounded, worried, and all of the other non-biologically based but nevertheless important psychiatric pathologies, if you want to call them that. So they started remedicalizing, and in the process, we just put together a plan for a behaviorally based unit. It wasn't anti-medicine, it would be jointly with psychiatry. But a room would not be a bedroom. It would be, we'd have Murphy beds that would fold up into the wall during the daytime. Each room would have a theme during the daytime. One would be maintaining plants, one would be a small engine workshop, one would be a cooking area and whatnot, so that people would have to be active during the day, doing something productive that would be hospitalized for mental illness. So it would be a milieu therapy in an intensive sense in the middle of the unit. Psychiatry, we were getting some notoriety for that, I think, and psychiatry got very worried. One of the psychiatrists at the clinic was feeding the national group information routinely about, we ought to stop this, we ought to get the psychologists out of the hospital. And in fact, national psychiatry did put pressure on the chair of the department, Dick Witherhead, to get the psychologists out of this kind of visibility position. And Dixon is an honorable man. He thought he had the perfect solution. He'd just say that we could no longer admit anyone to hospital or be in charge of them, that psychiatrists would be in charge of them, but then he would give us carte blanche to do what we wanted to, and he really would have. The problem with that is, as soon as we got a new chair, or in terms of public visibility, or in terms of the intellectual integrity of a profession, it was totally unworkable. No professional can literally be the servant of another professional. The definition of professional in my book is you're independently responsible for what you do. This would have, on paper, countermanded all that, although practically it would work fine. So I went to our administration and said, no way, this can't work. And I wasn't asking for Dixon to step down or anything, but the administration did ask him to step down as chair of the department. And then they set up a national search for another chair. Well, they obviously consulted the American Psychiatric Association. In fact, the search committee consisted entirely of psychiatrists, except I insisted on at least one psychologist, since psychologists were supposed to be part of the group. And that one psychologist didn't do us a whole lot of good. But guess who they picked as the new chair? The person that had been chairing the American Psychiatric Association committee that was saying, get the psychologists out of the clinic. And this was Steinhuber. He had a different, and both fortunately and unfortunately, workable solution. He didn't put a roof over the profession. He drew a wall and said, get them out of the hospital and they can do the outpatient kinds of things, but they can't do the inpatient. Well, that left the ceiling there and left us an independent profession. And several of us probably would have left at that time, except that there wasn't any place else that was any better. We would have gone into private practice. That was an option. That didn't appeal to me particularly. I don't think to anyone else there. There was no other institution that would give us the freedom to do any more. And so I was feeling a little bit uptight at that time. Well, the option of going down to Dayton to help put together a professional school came along at just exactly that particular time. So I just took 6 months to cool off as much as anything else.
Now, in addition to the state professional school, you've had visions of a national professional school. I know I've heard you speak of this. Could you just briefly talk a little bit about that, and is that still something that you think makes sense, or do you think its time has passed?
Well, there's several aspects of a national school. I thought that our model should be training the professionals in professional schools. There was some talk of a national school in Washington and D.C. that would be a good model, and I would be all for that. The basic issue, though, would be to shift from the philosophy of training our students in academic departments, giving them their clinical experience in medical settings, and then expecting them to be independent professional psychologists. It's nonsense. Was then and still is. Well, we were talking nationally. We were trying to reorganize APA. APA was going through some of the same things that OPA went through, except the academicians need a national association. They can't do without a national one any more than clinicians can. So there was a fight in APA about how to handle that. And I was on 2 blue ribbon committees of APA, and both times it seemed to me the only solution that would work, if it's going to be an APA solution, was to have an overarching council, but to have 2 essentially independent branches, one that dealt with the academic and one that dealt with the clinical side of things. Well, the second time that happened, Rodgers was president of APA, and the proposal we came up with was fairly similar to one that he had proposed, but it wasn't exactly his, and he got TO'd, and so he and Janet Spence and a few others put together APS, American Psychological Society, which is now the Association of Psychological Scientists, and that suited me just fine, because that was the academic side, and then APA could become the clinical side. Of course, Rodgers was a clinician himself, and did I say Rodgers? I'm sorry. Rodgers is a clinician, and he's first rate, and he had had nothing to do with APS or breaking that up. It was Logan Wright. Logan Wright from Oklahoma. Right. And Logan is a clinician, and so he insisted that there be a clinical branch in APS. And APA, of course, wouldn't turn loose of its single-digit divisions. And so both held on to both academic and there's still a fight. And I must say these days APS is a far stronger academic group than APA is. They're first rate in the basic sciences. Where they don't cover is the clinical areas that APA covers. And their clinical stuff, branch, APS's clinical branch, is nonsense. It's stupid, if you'll pardon the term. So that those were coming along at the same time. We were trying to restructure things. And my bias still is that the basic restructuring that needs to be done is not a national professional school. It would simply be a model in which we would try out some things, and that would have made more sense back when we were considering setting up different structures. But that we recognize that a practitioner profession needs solid grounding in basic science, not just in psychology, but in sociology, in anthropology, in economics, in the various fields that pertain to behavior. They don't need to be trained by academic psychologists. They need to be educated by academicians in a variety of fields. They need to be trained by professionals who are taking academic responsibility for the profession and making it respectable in a standard university, but not in a standard academic department. So that if we ever had that kind of training, then we'd have professional schools all over the country. We wouldn't have to have a national one, except again, I think the whole move, and this has been true in a variety of fields, is and should be toward national accreditation and national regulation, because the clinical needs are essentially the same in all state jurisdictions. The local control of things is state-based, but the standards are national-based these days.
You're going to like the next question. I think it comes to the essential Dave Rodgers, as I know you, and that is your definition of psychology. What is it now, where it seems to be going, and what it needs to become?
Well, psychology's definition now, I think, is whatever gets us a paycheck paid at the end of the month. And that's all of the niche markets where some knowledge of human behavior may supplement someone else's need to know, and where they'll pay us for providing that knowledge. That's not, to me, a very satisfying definition. It's a Me Too definition. We came in Me Too into the medical insurance business. We're Me Too in the school psychology business. We help other people with their problems. We're largely Me Too in industrial psychology, although there's a little more independence there. Me Too in terms of helping business leaders accomplish what they want to accomplish. Counseling is more Me Too in the general mental health community clinic business. We don't have an independent definition of who we are and where we are and what our primary focus is as independent professionals who are the best in the entire available universe for dealing with these particular problems. My bias is we start with the definition of a problem. In medicine, biological error. A physician is supposed to know about it or be able to deal with it regardless of where it is. Even if he says or she says, well, I'm not that familiar with that, but I have a colleague who is a physician who is familiar with that. If it's biological error, it's a medical problem. If it's a legal problem, if it's how do I deal with a law that says I'm doing the right thing or the wrong thing or whatever, it's a lawyer's problem. If it's a mental health problem, well, it could be a psychiatrist, could be a psychologist, could be a social worker, could be a counselor, could be where's our unique field? Well, I think we have one, but I don't think we articulate it. I think our unique field is human coping effectiveness. All the things it takes to cope effectively. We are biological creatures, but we still regulate that by a software that we call psychology. And if there's a breakdown in how effective we are in accomplishing something, that's a psychological problem. We should be the experts in how to deal with war and peace, if you please. Those are behaviors. With education, that's behavior. With industrial competence, work competence, with how you write social regulations and social laws, with how you deal with repressed thoughts, if you please, or with what makes up self-image, if you please. My bias, and you know, this could go on and on and on, but I'll try to be very brief about it. Our expectations drive all kinds of things. When we have expectations, it tells us we have expectations of it. If I do this, it's going to accomplish that. We do it, it doesn't accomplish that. That is a pathology from our own points of view. It generally precipitates an emotion. I get angry because it didn't accomplish that. Okay, psychology should be expert in how people develop expectations, educate themselves to understand what accomplishes what, overcomes blockages to doing certain kinds of things, and in effect deals with the complexity of expectations that drives our behavior. If we define ourselves that way, there's no one else that's that expert in that area. Let's go back to mental illness, for example, just to clarify things. I think there's no question that mental illness has a biological error embedded in it. But behavior often has to deal with error of all kinds, biological and otherwise, so that it doesn't, you don't solve it, but stabilizing the biological problem does not solve the psychological problem. How do you deal with a mental illness if you have it? How do you deal with a broken arm if you have it? There is psychology involved in all of that, and it's not secondary to the other, it's primary. It's not a matter of solving the biological error necessarily, it's a matter of how do you deal with it. Back even before we had the antipsychotics, there was a group in Los Angeles that said, in effect, it was a self-help group that said, if you are into hallucinations, we understand that, we all have that, but keep that until after you leave your job. Bring it home. Don't let it show at the office. And it worked to a significant degree. Well, this was treating the biological part of the mental illness as a disability that you had to cope with. The coping was psychological. The disability may have been biological. Those differences still exist. Therapeutic community out here in Mesopotamia, Hopewell, makes that exact distinction. They help people with severe mental illness who are stabilized under medication come to terms with their problems and learn how to cope in spite of that. That's, from my point of view, psychological. Now, they're running it, the therapeutic community history is a social history, and I could get into sociology too, but that's a different area. But nonetheless, what I'm saying is that my bias is that psychology should be expert in the problems of human coping, wherever they exist.
Now, I've heard we've discussed this many times personally, and I certainly agree with a lot of what you're saying there. The idea itself of coping effectiveness has not really caught on that well among psychologists, and I've not quite figured that out, except perhaps people are so busy doing the day-to-day thing they don't have time to sit and try to figure out what the field should be and what it's all about. Do you agree with that, or how do you conceptualize why psychology hasn't done more conceptualizing about what it's all about?
I have not, I can speculate about it, and my speculation would be there are about three dimensions to it. One is just pragmatically, those who are into the quotes clinical area, that is, whatever psychological problems exist, came into it at the time that the field bought into health insurance, which is basically medical insurance, which is basically paid when one is doing something that medicine controls. So we've subordinated ourselves to the third-party pay system, and in that sense have locked ourselves into medical necessity, which has locked us into a support position where we haven't really wanted to think too independently or to declare too loudly that what we do really isn't medicine, doesn't have much to do with medicine. Oh, okay, we won't pay you then. I think there's that dimension to it. I think there's the academic dimension, that the academicians are not thinking along those lines. They don't think about the dynamics of the profession. They think about the basic science, and they feel superior because they know more about the basic science, and therefore these are inferior people, and it's just as well if they are also subordinated to superior practitioners, just like they're inferior academicians and should be subordinated to superior academicians. And then there's the Practitioners themselves that have never wanted to run the risks of just going out on their own and living that competitive life of developing their own insurance base or their own fee-for-service base or their own institutions or this, that, or the other. And that's as much as anything else because we don't have our professional schools that in an academic sense, this is why you have a professional school in an academic department, to stimulate people to think, what's the cutting edge way of delivering services? And if we don't have them, you don't have your academicians doing what the professors in medical school are constantly doing. What's the best way to deliver medicine? If we did, I think that we would get those questions asked a lot more and a lot more honest answers.
And one other thing I know that you've spoken about a lot is the need for psychologists to develop their own diagnostic system. Could you briefly describe your thoughts about that?
Well, if you're responsible for dealing with a field of problems, it would help if you define what the problems are and clarify the kinds of problems you deal with and how you deal with them. And if we're dealing with something that's unique to our profession, who else is going to define them for us? Why haven't we? What we say when we don't do that is we don't have a profession. We practice junior psychiatry or I don't know what else.
Yeah.
But if we have a profession, questions we're responsible for, we should be defining the field. The way you do that in a clinical or health area is a nosology.
Right.
You categorize things.
And do I recall also that I think you said something about a house of one's own in the past, or if I remember correctly, and this may have come around the Wright State development time. But did this also include any concept, I know it has for some psychologists, so I'm asking your opinion, on a treatment location or facility or something of that sort that is distinctly psychological? You talked about your program there that was very psychological at the Cleveland Clinic, and yet then the
Politics.
The politics.
Yeah. George Albee first used the term house of our own back when he was, I think, just after he was president of APA or something. And yes, it makes all kinds of sense. That's what I've been talking about, that if you're going to be a professional, you should have your own field, your own profession. And that means that you should surround yourself with the tools you need to function in your profession. And psychology needs the same extension that medicine has. Physician is often described as having at least 20 extenders for every physician. You have pharmacists, you have nurses, you have technicians, this, that, and the other. Psychologist has an office and 2 chairs. Well, where is our structure that helps us function? 2 things about that. If we had a commitment to dealing with human behavior, then there are several things we need. We need to deal with acute problems. We need a 24-hour surveillance position. We need a hospital, the equivalent of a hospital, because there are people that are in acute behavioral states that need to be controlled for their own sake to get calmed down enough to start learning how to deal with their own problems. We need places where people can come. My bias is that sociology, when it gets really sophisticated, will contribute in major ways. One of them being, I think, biological impact can be instant. You can change the biological environment of an organ with one injection. Psychological impact tends to take time to think things through and come to conclusions. That often takes more time. Sociological impact is a matter of learning routines and internalizing them. You know how to shoot the basket, but you have to shoot it 1,000 times before it really goes in regularly. So it's an extended period of exposure. Well, by the same token, in order to get psychological things consolidated, you need people sometimes under fairly complete control for an extended period. So you need some kind of other facility. Tagging on, and it's not irrelevant at all, my bias is that our licensing laws in health field, medicine has an unlimited license to practice use whatever tools are necessary to correct a medical illness. As a result, most of the other fields that pertain to anything that medicine pertains to have been dealt with more in a monopoly term. Medicine monopolizes these techniques, and they can deal with anything that doesn't require these techniques. If they do require the techniques, medicine has to use them. We follow that same logic a bit in trying to set up our licensing laws to monopolize things. My bias is very simple. We should define all professions in terms of what they're expected to accomplish, give all of them unlimited licenses to accomplish what they're expected to. The limitation is medicine doesn't deal with legal problems. Lawyers don't deal with psychological problems. Psychologists don't deal with, whatever. You define your field of expertise, your field of social responsibility, and then you have an unlimited license to practice. Now, if we had that privilege of building our own house, we would certainly say, in order to deal with issues of depression that may be purely psychological, I'm depressed because I expected to get that promotion and the boss told me he's giving it to his son-in-law, and I go away depressed. That doesn't mean that I might not benefit at some point, might not benefit from some kind of medication support. Or if I've got other problems, I may need to get those out of the way. In order to deal with the psychological issues, I may need to have some monitoring of my pharmacological system. Well, if a psychologist had responsibility for doing that, just as a physician has responsibility for being a psychological counselor if the situation calls for that, and has the privilege of that, if we had that privilege, then we would start building a large field. We would paradoxically become more competitive, for example, with psychiatry or with medicine, but that competition would be healthy competition, not unhealthy, because it says, if you approach it from this perspective, does this work better than approaching it from this perspective? And experience would tell us which way works best. Now, you don't have the chance for experience because you have a monopoly that closes off certain kinds of competitions from both directions. And you have the specialization that is convenient but not challenging in any cutting-edge theoretical sense. So yes, I think a house of our own with much more unlimited license to practice and much more specific awareness of and definition of what it is we should be practicing would make all kinds of sense for the culture and for the profession.
Okay. Very good. Shifting gears a bit, since you've retired from the Cleveland Clinic a number of years ago, you've moved in other directions, one of them being the National Academies of Practice. I wonder if you tell us how you got to become involved with it and what role do you see psychology playing in this organization?
Well, the National Academies of Practice was Nick Cummings' idea back in around 1982, as I recall. This was when he was president of APA, or involved in APA heavily at that time. He always has been. And he was sitting down with some other people in some of the legislative hearings talking about health care reform at that time, and they were fighting with each other, as is typically the case. And he said to DeBakey and a couple of others, to Menninger, why don't we get together and speak as one voice instead of being so diffused and whatnot? And that makes sense. And so he started talking about setting up National Academies of Practice. Their concept would be it'd be kind of parallel to the National Academies of Science, which advises the government on scientific issues. Jack Wiggins and I can't turn that off, unfortunately.